This is Trend Following Radio, where great thinking comes alive. Nobel Prize winners, legendary traders, best-selling authors, and the pros that know what drive us irrational human beings. I am your host, Michael Covel. Not filtered, raw, honest. That's my passion. Continuing a little bit of my dig into the archives, summer of COVID, a little bit of a three-way for you today. Brian Christian, Chris Voss, Robert Cialdini. Brian Christian, great book, Algorithms to Live By. This stuff is Trend Following 101, and that's not what Brian intended. Fantastic stuff. Number 2, Chris Voss, former FBI agent, negotiator extraordinaire. Chris has a fantastic perspective on negotiating with anyone and, frankly, negotiating life. And last but not least, one of the most famous psychologists alive, Robert Cialdini. His book, Influence, his second book, Persuasion. These are both considered classics. If you're involved in business or just, frankly, dealing with people and you need to get across a view and influence them and persuade them, you got to dig in here. Again, I thank my lucky stars I get the chance to talk with all these bright people. They keep me on my toes and they educate me like crazy. Without any further delay, let's jump right into Brian Christian, Chris Voss, and Robert Cialdini. How in the world did you even start to go down this path with your co-author? Really?
I've really been going down this path since my teenage years. When I was in college, I was a double major in computer science and philosophy. You know, in some sense, each way of looking at the world started to permeate the other. And I began, thinking of computer science in philosophical terms, but also thinking about computer science as a way to approach the problems that I was facing in everyday life, the way that we would turn to a discipline like philosophy for advice on, the problems of the world, the things that we're grappling with. I actually found that computer science offered me, in many ways, an as compelling or more compelling framework, and really a vocabulary for kind of understanding the problems around me. And so, this is something that I've been thinking about for a very long time.
My background, having written several books on trading, I was just stunned to go through your work because, and I don't know if anyone said this to you yet, but if somebody is a trader, an investor in 2016, and they're serious about it, this is almost foundational, your work. Now, maybe that was not the intent, but in my world, so many of the quant traders, and I'm not talking about the high frequency stuff, but the kind of the longer term trend traders that have 100% automated strategies, all back tested, finding a positive mathematical expectation, understanding overfitting, understanding robustness, having it all automated. And to read your work, it's like, oh, wow, okay, whether intended or not, you guys just laid down the foundation for traders today.
Yeah, well, thank you. I mean, that's not an area that I know especially deeply, but it's certainly, I'm certainly aware that we're kind of living in this time in which a lot of the decision making that's going on in the world, finance being a great example, is increasingly being, executed by algorithms. There's this increasing need to understand just some of the larger ideas and the real principles of the field of computer science as a way of kind of making sense of how these things operate. And I think there's a real opportunity to bring some of those principles back to our own decision-making processes in our own lives. And so that's really where I see this book coming in, is it kind of completes this feedback loop where for the last 50 or 60 years, algorithm designers have begun by asking themselves how they would solve a problem. And that's often, any programmer's first draft of a piece of code that they're writing. But of course, as the field has matured, we've developed this formal rigor around being able to make assertions and make proofs around optimality and expectation and bounds and so forth. What we haven't seen is bringing that knowledge back around to improve our own intuitions. And so that's where I see this book coming in as kind of completing that circuit.
Let's talk the word algorithm. For people that know, they'll hear your words, they'll read your work, and they'll be like, oh, okay, it makes perfect sense. But for a lot of people, I know the word algorithm immediately brings about fear and confusion. And why don't you give a little of a historical perspective? Because an algorithm is just really a way to take things that we could do as a human being on a piece of paper with a pencil and taking it to the land of computer science. To the land of computers. So why don't you give a little bit of a narrative there? Because it's not necessarily so complicated. I think sometimes it's the vocabulary that causes people to pause.
Yeah, I think that's true. It's a word that today we associate, specifically with the world of computer science. But the principle of what makes an algorithm is it's really just a series of steps that you follow to solve a problem or make a decision. Algorithms in this sense are much older and much broader than the computer, of course. And, we all in school learned, for example, algorithms for doing long division, or, you subtract by carrying the one and so forth. But, it goes back even farther than that. I mean, you can think of and cooking following a recipe as being algorithmic in that sense. And so, mathematical procedures have been found on clay tablets dating back thousands of years. And so in many ways, they are not only older than the computer, but they are some of the first and oldest technology, if you will, of the human race, at least as old as the Stone Age.
So let's bring people into an example. I was thinking of one in my life inspired by your work, and perhaps you can take my example and run with it and pass along the lessons. Years ago, I was working on a documentary film. I had just moved to San Diego. I needed to hire a film assistant. I put a Craigslist ad out. I think approximately 30 female candidates showed up. The very first one was the most competent, but she scared me. I just moved to California. She was in a pantsuit. I don't know. She just scared me, and I didn't want to hire her on the spot. So I interviewed 29 other ladies, and they were just all not anywhere near her level. And then, in fact, the very last candidate, I can't even make this up. I laughed to myself about the very last candidate, as we were leaving, attempted to kiss me on the lips as an exit interview. So I went back and I hired the very first lady. And as it turns out, she ended up going to USC's film school and has a successful career now in LA. So it was a good choice, but I wasn't really using any kind of an algorithm probably described in your work. I was probably doing everything wrong.
Well, you certainly found yourself in one of the canonical problems of the 20th century, which is called the secretary problem. And it is almost exactly as you described. The canonical setup is you're hiring for a position and you get, N candidates. So in your case, 29 or 30 show up in a random order. At each step of the way, you evaluate the next candidate that comes in, and you have to either hire them on the spot and send everyone else away and never know if there might have been a better candidate out there, or you dismiss this candidate, in which case, in the classical version of the problem, you do not get the ability to call them back later and try to bring them back in. The crux of this problem is, how do you try to, of course, hire the very best person for the job without knowing in advance who that person is going to be? And at each step of the way, you're faced with making this irrevocable choice. Do you take the person in front of you and not know what else is out there, or do you send them away, but maybe you've just blown your best opportunity? This field in general is known as optimal stopping. And in the book, we sort of unpack the structure of optimal stopping problems and show that there are really a whole host of situations in life that take this form. And so one of the examples that we give is real estate. If you're looking to buy a house or rent an apartment, in most competitive markets, you are faced with exactly this kind of a dilemma where let's say you go to an open house and people are submitting bids pretty much on the spot. And so you have exactly this dilemma. How do you know when your best opportunity is without the ability to gather information and synthesize it before making a choice? And the classical version of the problem has this very famous solution, which is that you should refrain from making any offers for the first 37% of the applicant pool. And after that point, instantly extend an offer to the first person you see who's better than everyone you saw in the first 37%.
And it's very similar in thinking to something like a mathematical expectation type formula where you're just saying, okay, you're not trying to say you know the absolute best. You're saying it's the best for right now. Let's make a decision. Let's move on.
I think there's a deeper point here about this problem, which is that even following the optimal solution, it does not guarantee that you're going to get the optimal result every time. What it can offer you is, in this case, the best probability of getting the best outcome. And I think at a slightly deeper level, what it can offer you is really peace of mind. That usually when we make a decision and we don't necessarily get the outcome that we want, the first thing that we do is kind of play back the entire thought process that led to the actions that we took and sort of call into question everything that we did along the way. And there's something, I think, very consoling about having a mathematical or a computational understanding of the form of the problem that you're facing, which is that it enables you to be confident even when you don't get the result that you want. You can still know, hey, I followed the right procedure. I followed the right thought process in this case. Even if I didn't get the outcome I wanted, I don't have to call all of that into doubt because I know that I followed the right process.
Process versus outcome. They're not, I think that's one of the biggest issues we have in humanity today. We can have that great process, but we all still fixate on the outcome. Whereas we should be saying to ourselves, let's just follow a great process and know that we're going to have errors. We're going to have mistakes. But if we keep following the good process, we're going to be in a much better place in the long run.
I think that's exactly right. An understanding of the structure of the problem that we're facing, the basic characteristics of the optimal solutions, I think is a really powerful starting point in order to get a sense of what those processes should be.
And I'll give you an example in my world too. When you look at some of the traders today, let's say they have a 100% automated trading system and they'll get a signal that says buy. Well, most of the time, 60% of the time, perhaps that buy signal turns around, goes the other direction, and you have to take a small stop. As a human being, though, if you're just sitting there making the discretionary decision, you call into question, did I make the right move? Did I do the right thing? The computer just says, hey, I'm going to follow the rules. And we know in the long run, we want to get out if it doesn't go our direction. It's very, very similar to what you're outlining in your work.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I would add also that, there are some people who are skeptical, for example, that the structure of a classic optimal stopping problem really does describe the types of decisions that we face in everyday life. I mean, there is this very strict assumption in the problem that at each moment in time you have this irrevocable choice. And in your case, you encountered a real life example where the assumptions of the model were a little bit relaxed. In the case of making that higher, you were able to go back and extend an offer to someone even if you didn't hire them on the spot. In fact, there are optimal algorithms for this version of the problem too, which is known as recall. Trading, I think, offers a wonderfully stark example where, as you describe, at each moment in time, you have this extremely fleeting and ephemeral opportunity. You must make a decision on the spot. If you buy, then you can't reverse that without some pain, right? But also, if you fail to act, then the opportunity may go away, and you don't have the opportunity to rectify that also. In fact, many aspects of the financial world are implicitly modeled using optimal stopping under the hood. I know that American stock options, for example, if you want to assign a value to the option to buy something or the option to sell something, how do you assign a value to that? Well, implicitly, you have to make some assumptions about whether that person is going to be able to know the correct time, the best time to exercise that option. The mathematics of optimal stopping are at work under the hood of some of these things that are familiar to traders.
As you talk, as you explain, I think back to my MBA program and I say to myself, I thought I really only learned two things of great value in my life, the definition of a sunk cost and an opportunity cost.
Yes, absolutely.
Yeah, it's right. It's right there in that, right in the same headspace. Let me let you tear apart another word. You mentioned it earlier, and plenty of people are going to know, but probability is a sticky wicket for people. But let's talk about probability, because again, it's the process versus outcome thing. And it's like whether we're talking poker or the MIT blackjack team, trading, VC financing, probability is really the success foundation of so many businesses today. And I don't think that's necessarily properly understood by so many people that don't have the training or the understanding.
Yeah, I think, furthermore, one of the key things that compounds the problem of dealing in probabilities is we're also dealing in uncertainties. That you might have information about two things, and you're trying to decide between them, but not only is the information probabilistic in nature, it's also uncertain. So to give you a concrete example, let's say there are two airlines that you fly. One of them you fly more than the other. Let's say one of them has been on time 9 out of 15 flights, so 60%. The other one you've only flown twice, and it was on time once, and it was late once, so only 50% performance. Simply put, you're trying to decide what's the smarter airline to take for your next flight. There's one that's been on time 60% of the time, 9 out of 15. The other's been on time 50% of the time, 1 out of 2. But in this case, it's compounded by this other factor, which is that you just don't have as much information about the second airline as you have about the first. How should we try to make the best decision when we're comparing these two different quantities? There's a famous problem in computer science called the multi-armed bandit problem, which is sort of an odd name, but it comes from the idea of the slot machine as the one-armed bandit. And it's exactly this. It's like you walk into a casino, there are all these slot machines that pay out at different rates with different probabilities. But crucially, you don't know which machines pay off at which rates and which are better than others until you start playing them. And I think that's something that's very true in many aspects of life. And so the critical thing to a computer scientist is what's called the explore-exploit trade-off. So you have to very consciously trade off how much energy you're going to spend gathering information and how much of your energy and your time and your money you're going to spend leveraging the information that you've already gained to try to get the best outcome that you can. And I think there are so many situations in life where we have to trade off in exactly this dimension. I mean, careers being one example where, you have people weighing, is it worth trying to start over in a different career track? Or is it worth going back to school to get this additional credential and things like this? Or is it worth exploring this new business possibility? Or should I just sort of hone and refine the thing that I have? And in fact, mathematicians and computer scientists that have done some of the most important work on the multi-armed bandit problem and the explore-exploit trade-off have done a lot of it for companies that were explicitly trying to decide how to allocate their resources between these more exploratory things and the things that have a known payoff. So one of the best examples was that in the 1970s, the Unilever Corporation, pharmaceutical company, hires this mathematician, John Gittins, and they say, tell us what percentage of our budget we should be spending on R&D for experimental drugs and what percentage of our budget we should spend, on just marketing for drugs that are already profitable. And so this gives us a formal framework for thinking about what are otherwise kind of apples and oranges types of comparisons.
I love the one expression used in your work, and I could see it as a book title in the future: win, stay, lose, shift.
Yes. So this was one of the very first results that came out in this area. So the multi-armed bandit problem has this really colorful history in the history of mathematics, where for most of the 20th century it was considered unsolvable, not just a difficult problem, but literally unsolvable. And in fact, the Allied mathematicians in Great Britain during World War II joked about dropping the multi-armed bandit problem over Germany as the ultimate instrument of intellectual sabotage. But to the field's own surprise, they started making a series of gradual breakthroughs in the second half of the 20th century, kind of chipping away at the problem. And one of the first was this finding that this very simple algorithm called win, stay, lose, shift was better than just playing at random, which is a very modest result, but it was really the first key stepping stone towards the full solution of the problem. And the basic intuition behind win, stay, lose, shift is just, if something worked, do it again. If you flew the airline and it was on time, fly them again the next time. If you went to a conference and it was profitable or otherwise kind of worthwhile, go again. If you went to a restaurant and you had a good meal there, go back. But the lose shift part of it means that as soon as you don't get a good outcome, try something else. So as soon as your airline is late, then try the competitor the next time.
You can see why I love this, because I'm thinking immediately, again, in investment terms, and I'm thinking, ride your winners, cut your losers.
Yeah, exactly. And so it's a great example of what is just this wonderfully intuitive and succinct policy that we're actually able to say, with the full rigor of the field, there are some really positive bounds that we can put on this. We can sort of certify that it's a reasonable approach. It's not necessarily the optimal approach, but it's pretty good, and it's extremely easy to implement.
The win-stay part of it is momentum almost. It's kind of like just follow the momentum. You don't necessarily know why. You might not be able to answer the why, but the stay with it. And there's a lot of value to that. And that's very counter to human intuition, I believe.
The basic logic, at least if you're thinking about the formal version of the problem, is, if at time t, let's say, it made sense to go with a certain choice, a certain restaurant, a certain airline, you name it. If it already made sense to do that, and then you do it, and it pays off, well, it can only make more sense to do it again, because it can only raise your estimate of it paying off in the future.
Let me say for the audience right now, too, since I could literally sit here and ask you questions for hours, I'm not going to get you for hours. But even if I talked for hours, I would not even come close to covering 5%, 2%, 1% of what's in this book. This is extremely dense. And so I do highly recommend it to people to jump in. It's just a fantastic foundation. That said, I want to jump around a little on you. And I love one example, one story, and you can keep tying it into where we're going. But you talk about Jeff Bezos, and you talk about Jeff. Jeff is early in life at an investment firm, looking forward in life, and then imagining looking backward and thinking about that from an algorithmic standpoint. Why don't you explain that story? I think it's a fantastic way to bring people into your thinking.
Yeah, absolutely. So Jeff Bezos, of course, we all know him now as the CEO of Amazon, but he started off in investment banking. He was at a very prestigious and successful firm. I believe it was D.E. Shaw, and he was working in New York City, and he has this inkling, as he explains to his boss at the time, that he wants to leave this investment firm and start an online bookstore in Seattle, which at the time just seemed like, insanity of why would you leave this extremely lucrative, successful position to do this thing that to pretty much anyone at the time seemed like just a total lark. This thing that was just so unlikely to work. And the way that he found himself framing that decision in his own mind was what he calls a regret minimization framework, which I think is a really lovely approach to decision making, where, as you say, he projected himself forward in time and imagined himself at 80 looking back. What he realized was that he would not regret having tried, even if he failed, but he would regret not having tried. And so from that perspective, it just made the decision incredibly easy for him. And of course, we all know what happened after that.
Well, if you put aside even the current day Amazon success, I really do think this idea of the regret minimization framework, I've never thought of it that way. And it is quite beautiful, because if you're a young person or whatever age you are, to say with the limited time that I have left, and that's always uncertain too, but to try and look ahead and say it that way, it changes the dynamics so much, because it really, if you're honest about it, it forces you out of the comfort zone to say, oh, wow, what am I afraid of, really? Because if I'm going to get to 80 and I'm going to look back, I don't want to just say I just clocked in every day for 50 years and I got a gold watch. It really is it's a great way to think.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's, it's a little bit of a memento mori of sorts. It's kind of a lights a fire. But also, as you say, I think it's a really good analytical framework as well. Part of what I think is so lovely about this idea of regret minimization is that it has this formal parallel as well within the field. That there is explicitly a class of algorithms that are called regret minimization algorithms. For example, in the multi-armed bandit problem, you can formalize the notion of regret. So in this problem, you walk into this casino, there are all these different slot machines, but you don't know which ones pay out more than others until you start trying them. And so you can formalize the notion of regret as the money that you could have made if only you knew at the beginning of your time in the casino what you knew by the end. And so you can assign regret this very specific number. From there, you can ask all these sort of interesting mathematical questions. For example, how does your regret grow over time as a function of following, the best possible strategy? As it turns out, following the optimal algorithms in this problem, your regret will grow, specifically, it will grow logarithmically. The bad news is that even following the best possible strategy, you are still going to make mistakes. You're still going to continue making mistakes all the way through your life. But the frequency and the intensity of those mistakes will go down, and it will keep going down as you go through your life. And so that is something that I think is oddly consoling or very sort of heartening. Specifically, there are a set of algorithms called regret minimization algorithms that can offer this guarantee or this bound of logarithmic regret in that problem. And specifically, my favorite of these is what's called upper confidence bound. And this is another one of these things where I really feel like there's a profound life lesson in this very technical subject. So the idea of the upper confidence bound algorithm is that it says, for each of these opportunities, there is a kind of a confidence interval. There are these error bars around how good I think it could reasonably be. There's a middle of the bell curve where my sort of expectation lies, but there's also these tails that surround that, or these error bars that go both above and below. The upper confidence bound algorithm says just very simply, ignore your actual expectation of what's probably going to happen. Ignore the worst case scenario. Focus exclusively on doing the thing that has the best case scenario. And this is an algorithm that's been shown to minimize regret. And to me, that's just this very sort of human takeaway from this problem, that we can literally minimize our regrets in life by focusing on the things that have the most positive potential. To me, that's very profound.
From there, so we think about Bezos and this great framework. Now, of course, once he jumped, he then had to have his stopping point, Amazon, to some degree. Perhaps that wouldn't have worked out and he would have had to try another venture. I don't know. But it did work out. But there, on the flip side of this, there are many people that have that spirit that Jeff had, but perhaps, and I'm kind of reading from what you say here, but there's many people that they tend to over-explore. So they favor the new disproportionately over the best. You have these people that have the energy and excitement to go jump like Bezos did, but they keep jumping and they can never sit still.
Right. That there is the possibility to go too far in that direction. Yet one of the things that I think is quite interesting is having looked at the problem and looked at what characterizes the optimal strategies, the optimal algorithms in the scientific literature, there's this irresistible question, which is that what real people actually do in real life when they're confronted with these types of problems? In each chapter, we kind of delve into the psychology literature and say, what does it look like when you actually throw people into a lab setting and have them go through these sorts of tasks? Do they do what the optimal algorithm would have them do? In almost every case, the answer is no, they don't. And so there's a real opportunity there to ask, well, why is that? Is that because people are just, stupid or misinformed or kind of poorly designed by evolution for these sorts of tasks? Is it perhaps that it's the models that are wrong, that the people are in some sense doing something smarter than what the theory has gotten us to? In the case of explore-exploit problems, there is this very consistent result, which is that people tend to over-explore. They gather more information than they need to. They don't commit as much. They second-guess themselves more than they should, and that sort of thing. The famous experiment in which this comes up was one by Amos Tversky and some of his colleagues back in the either 60s or 70s. They had this setup where they had a box with two lights on it. One of the two lights would come on with varying frequency. And they said, okay, we're going to press this button that will turn one of these two lights on. We're going to do it 1,000 times. And each time you have the opportunity to either observe the light or place a bet on what you think which light you think is going to come on. But you do not get to observe which light came on. And you do not find out until the end of the experiment whether you won or lost money on that bet. It turns out that the optimal strategy in this case is, I believe, you make 38 observations in a row, and then you blindly place a series of 962 bets on whichever light came on more at the beginning. This is not what people do at all. They are much more exploratory. They gather much more information. They will observe for a long period of time, then they will make a series of bets, then they will go back to observing, then they will make a series of more bets, then they'll go back to observing. Well, someone had a closer look at the raw data from this study and came to a realization that I think is quite significant, which is if the probabilities that these different lights were coming on was on a random walk, if it was varying over time, well, then what the human subjects were doing is in fact extremely close to the optimal solution. This is a version of the problem known as the restless bandit problem. Then you can ask the question, well, okay, why are subjects behaving as though these payoffs are volatile when we've told them ahead of time that they're fixed? I think an appropriate response to that is, well, there's subjects in a psychology experiment, so I think it's perfectly reasonable for them to doubt the description of the scenario that the experimenters gave them, because there is a long storied history of psychology researchers lying to subjects. So I think it's probably appropriate that the subjects didn't take it on face value. But the deeper point here is that when you find yourself in one of these restless bandit problems, when the fundamental truths can change, the world itself can change, the environment that you're in can evolve, well, then you really should spend more of your time gathering information and commit for smaller stretches of time before gathering more information. And so it turns out that humans' instinct to quote-unquote over-explore is in fact very well adapted for the sort of dynamic and changing world that I think better describes a lot of the scenarios that we're actually in.
We also run the risk, though. Let's say an investor, for example, wants to make an investment in Tesla. How much information do you gather and when do you stop? These become tricky questions because in many ways, I can think of many investors that would say, I want the most simplistic data, a simple price momentum, and I'll bet off the price momentum alone, versus some other investors might say, I need to have, untold amounts of fundamental information, but the untold amounts of fundamental information never end.
Yes, right. While you are gathering all that information, you might be missing out on your best opportunity, your best window, right, to buy.
Right.
And one of the key factors in any sort of explore or exploit problem is this question of how much time you feel you have. What is the interval of time over which you are trying to optimize? By analogy, if you are living abroad, let's say for a year, the first week that you're there, even if you discover an amazing restaurant, you probably don't want to go back twice in the same week because, the second restaurant that you try in that country has a 50% chance of being better. And the third restaurant you try has a 1 in 3 chance of being better, which is pretty high. And moreover, if you do find a restaurant that's better than the best one you already know about, you have 51 weeks to enjoy it and keep going back. Conversely, if you imagine yourself in the last week of your trip, well, the odds that a restaurant that you try are the odds that a new restaurant you try is better than the best ones you already know about are quite small. You're able to set a pretty high bar as a result of your experience. But furthermore, even if you did find a restaurant that was better than the ones you already know about, you've run out of time to continue to enjoy that. One of the things that you find when you look at some of the solutions to the explore-exploit trade-off is that our decision-making can and should change as a function of where we perceive ourselves to be within that interval of time. And this is, of course, something that comes up in investing contexts. If you have, a passive retirement account, for example, you sort of plug in your expected retirement year. A lot of these funds will typically pursue a very high-risk strategy 40 years out from retirement, and then gradually, for example, move the money from stocks into bonds as you get closer to retirement. And I think the same type of dynamic exists in this question of, do I continue to gather information or do I just leverage the information that I have? It's partly a function of the amount of time over which you're going to be committed to your action. So if I'm committing if I'm committing a bunch of money into Tesla, to use your example, and it's going to be, locked in for, let's say, 50 years, then it probably makes sense to do a lot more of that fundamental research. But if I'm just going to be parking my money there for, a month or 6 months or something, then it's more important to just sort of try different things out and commit on the basis of what we already know.
Let me jump to another part of the book, something that I really liked, because I could stay in one chapter and just start picking your brain for the next few hours. But computers have this really great technique, this capacity to multitask, and I'm going to let you explain it. It's called threading. But we as human beings, we really don't have this ability to thread, do we, effectively?
Yeah, I mean, not really. Just despite the fact that, one of the things that really distinguishes the brain from, a computational architectural standpoint, one of the things that really distinguishes the brain is this massive parallelism. It's ironic, given that we can't really process more than one, train of thought at a time, right? Or have more than one conscious, deliberate experience at a time. We have to kind of yank our attention back and forth. And in many ways, this is, in fact, quite like what computers do, They just do it at a much faster time scale, and so they can create the illusion of doing more than one thing at the same time through this process that's called threading. And the basic idea behind threading is that you have a series of processes that are running, but the CPU can only attend to one of them at a time. It will spend a little bit of time, flashing your cursor, and then yank itself to, your inbox, and spend a little bit of time, pinging to see if there's new mail in your inbox, and spend a little bit of time, buffering your audio so that your Spotify in the background keeps playing smoothly. And by hopping around from thing to thing nimbly enough and quickly enough, it can create this wonderful illusion of simultaneity. But as anyone who has used computers in the last 50 years can attest, sometimes this breaks down and we end up staring at the hourglass or the spinning beach ball of doom. And so I think it can be very instructive to understand what's actually going on under the surface in those cases, because I think there's really a connection between how a machine's time management can fall to pieces and some of the human traps that we all recognize from our own lives. The biggest pitfall for a system that's managing a multitude of threads is what's called thrashing. The basic idea behind thrashing is, as the computer is managing these different things, there's a certain amount of overhead associated with changing from one task to another. And this is known as context switching. So in a computer, that means you're repopulating your caches with different information. You are kind of bookmarking and saving your progress on the previous task so that you can come back to it later. You're finding your place in the next task and sort of queuing it up and getting started. And so there's a certain amount of fixed overhead associated with every context switch. And so if you imagine, let's just say for the sake of argument, it takes the system 1/10 of a second to context switch. It's really more like a millionth of a second, but let's just say for the sake of argument, it's 1/10 of a second. If you're doing 10 different things and you have a policy that you don't let something go longer than 1 second before you do at least a little bit of work on it, then the system ends up in a state where it only has 1/10 of a second allocated to each task, but it requires the entirety of that 1/10 of a second just to page the sort of now where was I information back into its proverbial head. And so you can have a situation in which the computer is spending literally 100% of its time doing these sort of bookkeeping meta tasks. And what's really brutal about this situation is that because it is not actually advancing the state of any of its threads, it's extremely difficult to get out of because it's not doing any real work. And so it's not likely to terminate any of those processes and bring the system back to a more stable state.
Nice description of human nature, huh?
Yeah, I mean, I honestly, I see more of myself in that description than I'm comfortable with. I think we've all had moments where we've felt, if you've ever spent more time mentally keeping track of all of the things that you have to do than actually doing them, then you're basically in a position of thrashing, where the meta work and the bookkeeping has overwhelmed the actual work that you're doing.
Brian, let me bring up one more topic with you before I let you leave. This one really is near and dear to me. I'm so sad to see its demise, but I started as a Eudora Mail user probably in the mid 1990s. And what I loved about Eudora Mail is that, and I had to stop, I think in 2013, they stopped supporting it on the Mac. But what I loved about it is that I could sort things, right? But But if I needed to search on Eudora Mail, and they've basically, all the folks in Silicon Valley have eliminated this opportunity for me. It does not exist. Eudora Mail still cannot be beat for search. If I wanted to search a decade of email and find anything from a thought to an IP address, you name it, Eudora search was just absolutely awesome. The searching versus sorting conundrum is something you cover in your work a lot. Why don't you speak to it some from your perspective, and maybe perhaps a lesson or a story that might give people a window into what you guys have discovered and put out for us?
Yeah, absolutely. One of the canonical domains of computer science that would be familiar to any computer science student is sorting algorithms. In many ways, this is one of the canonical computer tasks. How do you sort a set of things as efficiently as possible? In the book, we get into the history of sorting algorithms and what advice they might hold for us about the best way to, organize our household items like our bookshelves and so forth. But I think that the deeper principle here is that for a computer scientist or for a computer system, there is really one and only one reason that you would sort things in the first place, which is to save yourself time searching for those things later. That, I think, is a very deep point that leads to a way of thinking about the question of sorting, which is really, should you be sorting at all? Will the act of sorting something save you more time in subsequent searches than the act of sorting it would itself take?
It's a really deep thought.
And so you end up with, in many cases, a computational argument for mess. That there are a number of things in life that, we as humans attach kind of a moral dimension to, or a guilt with something being messy. When in fact, there is this argument that can be made in a number of situations where mess is not only the easy choice, but it can also be the optimal choice. Computer science, of all things, it's ironic because we think of computers as kind of the paragons of organization. But computer science gives us the language to actually formulate the rigorous argument for mess. And that for me is really sort of counterintuitive and cool. It's
very cool. Really, it's there's so many kind of aha moments in this work. I really appreciate you putting it together. I do want to read one last sentence, which I think for the audience to keep you thinking as to why this is important. And this is from your work. The underlying directive of any good algorithm is to minimize the labor of thought. We all want to do that.
Absolutely. Yeah. I think that's one of the kind of unintuitive things about computer science is that the goal of any algorithm is to minimize computing. To a computer scientist, computing in some sense is the enemy or is bad. And so I think there's something we can all sort of take heart in, that there's, in any decision-making process, there is this critical component of just knowing when to stop thinking or knowing how hard to think about something. And computer science gives us a way of not only making the best decision when we have perfect information and all the time in the world, but it also gives us a way of thinking about how to make smart trade-offs when we don't have those luxuries. And I think that's much more often the case that we find ourselves in.
Brian, the work, Algorithms to Live By, The Computer Science of Human Decisions, with your co-author, Tom Griffiths, available everywhere. I think it's doing really well, isn't it?
Yeah, in fact, we're just in our third printing now, so it's been really encouraging seeing the reception it's been getting.
You've got all Silicon Valley reading this, right?
Yeah. In fact, I just ran into a friend of mine on the subway. We were talking about the book, and the guy standing next to me, whips around and says, "Oh my God, you wrote Algorithms to Live By? I love that book." So yeah, it's really satisfying when you can feel like the work that you're doing is reaching people who are sensitive to it and who are able to take something out of it. That's really meaningful.
Beyond Amazon to buy, is there a website people should check out?
Algorithmstoliveby.com.
Brian, I thank you for taking the time. Hopefully I can have you on again when the next work comes, because I know a next work will come.
Absolutely. It's been a total pleasure. So I would love that. Thank you very much for having me.
Chris, I want you to go back in time to when you were a lead negotiator for kidnappings in the FBI. Pretend, and I don't know how to do this because I've never kidnapped anybody, I've never done something like this, but pretend for the moment that I have secured some wealthy businessman's daughter and I am saying I need $1 million within 24 hours. You have reasonable belief that I'm serious. You have reasonable belief that there should be some concern. Out of the gate, how do you initially, what starts to go through your head, and how do you approach when you first make contact with me? How do you approach that situation right out of the gate? I think if people can get into your mind at this very initial phase, I think it could be really interesting and useful.
Once I had done it enough that I really understood it, I understood the guy on the other side. I know what you need to feel in order so that you'll relax and let me slip gently into the driver's seat. I know that you need to feel that you're going to accomplish your goals, and what you lust for more than anything else is money. I mean, the harder anybody demands anything, and a kidnapper is demanding extremely hard, then that means that's the harder they want it, which really means I've got the leverage if I don't fight you for power. The minute I make you feel in control, large, and in charge, and then I take a deferential approach, I start to get the upper hand on you, and you're blind to it because you're driving for control.
Okay, but I have the control right now. I've got the girl. I need the money from you. You don't have any control. You're just a guy talking to me on the phone, Mr. FBI.
Yeah, how many people in the world are you going to sell that girl to?
Well, that starts to be the process right there.
Yeah, and I'm not going to say that out and out because I know that this is a buyer's market. There is one buyer on the entire planet. And since I know that, then, really I've got you. You can't go anywhere else. If you don't make a deal with me, then you don't make a deal. And you put too much in time investment into this. You put a massive, you're all the way in here. You got nowhere else to go. So if I know all that, then I just have to covertly take advantage of that in the negotiation. And I know that you're driving for control. And I know that you've done this so many times that you feel like as soon as I'm afraid that you feel in control. You've got one move. You got one approach with me. And it's like any other control-oriented negotiator. You let a control-oriented negotiator feel in control and they drop their guard. So I know what's going on behind the scenes with you emotionally, and I'm just willing to accept that and play it.
It is truly fascinating, and I think people can just hear that initial little story with us and they can start to imagine that type of thinking, you taking yourself the best that you can as the person on the other side dealing with the terrorist or kidnapper, that you taking your emotion out of it and you looking at it essentially as a game. How do you play the game best to get the objective that you want, correct?
Yeah, it is. And it's, I like to think of it as sort of like spring-loaded chess, because a lot of people want to think of negotiations as chess, which is move, counter move, and very complicated. But first of all, negotiation isn't move, counter move. I may make 3-4 moves in a row. I may want you to make 3-4 moves in a row. And then, of course, every move that I make, since, Herb Cohen said a long time ago that negotiation is influence within a web of tension. The web of tension is emotions and what we want, which means that all the pieces are spring-loaded with this tension of emotion. And every time a piece moves, all the other pieces on the board move a little bit too, which is why you can't think, in a chess game, you can think 14 moves ahead. In negotiation, you can really only think about 3 or 4 moves ahead, and then the whole board resets, and you have to rethink your goals. And when you get comfortable with that, then actually you are now playing at a much higher level than the person on the other side is.
Let's go back in time a little bit. I want the audience to understand some of your background. You go into the FBI what year?
1983.
Go back to 1983. So you're just getting out of college. You go directly to the FBI. What was motivating you to go into the FBI?
No, I've been a cop, street cop, uniformed police officer, Kansas City, Missouri, for about 3 years. I loved being a cop. It was challenging. It was an opportunity to be very creative and be very innovative and do good at the same time. I have to admit, I liked doing good. I always have. And I'd really enjoyed it, but then I'd, gotten a bug of federal law enforcement in my head, and the opportunity to maybe travel around the world. And I am a small town Iowa boy, and I had never been to Mexico, and I'd kind of seen Canada. The prospect of international travel really intrigued me, and that's why I looked at federal law enforcement. And I was very lucky that the FBI was hiring a bunch of people by the time I put in my application, and I kind of got in with the crowd.
So I could go down many data points, and I'm going to jump ahead a little bit, but you're in the FBI. You eventually get yourself to a place where you are one of the lead international, if not lead, international kidnapping negotiator for the Bureau. How did that happen? What was the impetus? How did the negotiation inside the FBI get you to that place?
It was a combination of my terrorism time in New York City. I was on a joint terrorist task force in New York, worked with some fantastic guys, was lucky enough to put together some great cases. Actually, myself and my partners, we won the Attorney General's Award for Excellence in Law Enforcement, which is, it was a great honor. It's kind of a pinnacle thing. There are about 3 FBI agents every year that get it. Not very many people get it at all. And so I had a lot of terrorism experience, and I'd become a hostage negotiator. And again, I got lucky. I negotiated a bank robbery with hostages, which is a really rare event. It happens in the movies all the time. In real life, it happens in the United States about once every 20 years.
What's the old Al Pacino movie?
When I did the bank robbery in Brooklyn, it was actually 20 years since the Al Pacino movie Dog Day Afternoon had taken place, and they referenced it because it had been that long since something like that had happened in New York City. So yeah, it was the same kind of thing, only we talked everybody out. Nobody got shot, nobody got killed, and the first bank robber to surrender actually surrendered to me personally outside the bank.
When he surrendered to you, was he relieved?
He was. He came outside. He followed the instructions of the SWAT guys to the T, so he didn't get hurt. And he didn't see me right away. And when he came out, he actually looked around and said, "Where's Chris?" Because, he was looking for me. He was listening to my voice. He only knew me by my voice. And he wanted me to walk up, and he was looking forward to meeting me because he took his life in his own hands when he went in the bank, and he took his life in his own hands when he came out, and he put his life in my hands, and so he was relieved. He was happy to be out of it.
And was that your first big kind of experience where you started to build a foundation of what was going to become a career in this?
I'd been trained as a hostage negotiator a little more than a year earlier, and I'd spent a lot of time on a suicide hotline. So, which is pretty much the same thing. A crisis hotline, suicide hotline is the same thing as hostage negotiation. There's just no SWAT team. So by the time I got into the real deal, I really felt like I understood the process and I knew what I was doing. But this was the first real big event that I was ever involved in. Yeah.
Let's jump ahead a little bit more. We're going to kind of backfill on some cases and some ideas and examples. But where did you eventually leave the FBI? And I think the number that I saw is you were involved in over 150 cases, kidnapping cases. I mean, with that type of a unique experience, it's sometimes got to be an unusual thing where you realize there's not a lot of peers that you can kind of share notes with. I mean, it's not a lot of people that have that particular experience set. How did you start to understand and make the jump to where all of this experience you had built up inside law enforcement, inside the Bureau, a fairly niche skill set, which maybe you always knew it had wider applicability, maybe you didn't. But when did you start to realize that this niche skill set really wasn't so niche and it was applicable well beyond what you had been trained in?
Well, Well, the seeds of it really started when I first started on the crisis hotline, because that stuff was so effective with people in crisis. I thought this has to work in daily life and business life. And so I started.
Give an example right there. When you say you're on the crisis hotline, think back to an example that you could give some color where you're on a call, that you can't see the person, they can't see you, and you walk someone down. Does anything come to mind for you?
Yeah, well, there was one call in particular. This guy calls up one night, and he says, "Hey, look, I need help putting a lid on the day. I got to put a lid on the day." And I heard frantic in his voice. And at that time, we did something called reflection. Now, in business terms, I call it a label. And I heard a negative driver, and I said, "You sound frantic." It's that simple. And science now backs it up. You simply identify a negative driver, a negative emotional driver in somebody, and it diminishes it. And as soon as I say, "You sound frantic" to this guy, I feel his voice strengthen, and I feel him calm down in our subsequent conversation. Instantly, I feel the change. And I now know that the electrical activity in his brain diminished the moment he heard me say that. And so then he begins to talk to me. He's struggling with a problem. He's paranoid, and he's going to go on a car trip the following day with his family. And he knows that on the car trip, his paranoia is going to make him a basket case. So thinking about it now the night before, he's becoming a basket case, thinking about being a basket case. He's telling me about how hard his family is helping him work through this problem. And it occurs to me, his family sounds very close. They're very supportive. And I can remember in a previous conversation, in a personal interaction, describing my family to a friend. The friend at the time said to me, "Your family sounds really close." And the moment he said that to me, it felt so good. I mean, it felt so good. It was like a physical, chemical change. I reacted so positively to it. And so I said the same thing to this guy. I said, "It sounds like your family's really close." And bang, I could feel him strengthen, which is, again, to tie it into business. I do the same thing in business. If somebody's really driven by their company, I say, "Well, it sounds to me like your mission, your purpose here is really important to you." People love that, and they move towards you when you do that. So I said, "Sounds like your family's really close." And bang, a whole bunch more strength came into his voice. So now, with a very much more lucid and clear tone of voice, he's outlining all the things that he's doing to beat paranoia. And the culmination of this effort, to me, he sounded like a very determined guy. So I just said that. I said, "You sound really determined." And he goes, and he says it just like this. He says, "Yeah." He says, "I am determined. And you know what? I'm going to go on that car trip tomorrow, and I'll be fine. Thanks for taking the time to talk to me." And he hangs up. And all I did was say three things, but I hit three, two distinctive portions of his amygdala, which is where all our emotions go through our brain. And I diminished one, and I strengthened two others, and he moved. And the conversation didn't take 5 minutes. And he moved in a very positive direction. And that night was so powerful. And between all the training I've done in hostage negotiation, everything I've learned since, and then actually these days, when they have brain scientists that do an MRI of our brain and then wire us up to see where the electrical activity, I now know that this is science-based application of tactical emotional intelligence. And it took me a really long time and a lot of experimentation to get it to this point. But then, so I go through my bureau career trying to figure this out. I'm the lead international kidnapping negotiator. We got a kidnapping that didn't turn out the way I expected. And I knew we did everything we knew how to do, flash forward another 20 years. And so then I just wanted to go outside hostage negotiation. I went to Harvard Law School to study with them. And those guys were like, "Look, until you realize it, we already see it. What you're doing is the same thing we're doing. You're just doing it with different stakes." And from that point forward, as I got ready to leave the bureau, then I was absolutely determined that this stuff works in business.
Let's talk about some of the key architects behind negotiation, at least in your world and how you've synthesized your technique. Two names come to mind that I'm familiar with, that you're familiar with, Bill Urey and Daniel Kahneman. Why don't you talk about each for a moment, the influence they had on you and how they connect together? I think you know this as well, too. I've had both of them on my podcast, both very interesting guys, clearly two of the top minds. But why don't you speak to both of them and how that's kind of worked into your life and your technique?
Well, yeah, getting to yes, Bill Urey, Roger Fisher, and everything that they brought through in a Harvard program on negotiation. I mean, laying out a very intellectual, rational structure for the entire negotiation process. Probably intellectually unassailable. I mean, they lay this stuff out and they put together such a framework so that anybody that goes deep into negotiation to try to understand the dynamics is benefited by reading anything that Bill Urey has written in understanding how the structure should work among rational human beings. Danny Kahneman, on the other hand, helped us understand that there's no such thing as rational human beings. And that's when we went away really in the negotiation world from game theory. And even to this day, if somebody wants, if I were to say I was going to teach a game theory in negotiation, everybody would sign up because we were like, how do I outsmart the other guy? How do I outplay him in chess? And they've gone away from game theory to behavioral, psychological, economic behavior. And how do people really tick? And boy, Danny Kahneman and Amos Tversky, I mean, hit it on the head with prospect theory. And reading anything by either of these guys, I'm such a huge fan because not only did they discover great stuff about people's fear of loss and what really drives us, and that we're more likely to take a risk to avoid a loss than we are to take a risk to accomplish a gain. Plus, when Danny Kahneman talks about the development, they had so much fun working together. And they thoroughly enjoyed the process. And even though they were scientists, they would bounce stuff off their family and friends. And they're not ashamed to admit that they were constantly having fun, learning with each other. And they felt better about life working together. And hearing Kahneman talk about that is inspiring to me, let alone what he brought to our understanding of how human beings tick. And I kind of mashed those things together with my hostage negotiation experience and have come up with this framework. I think we've got some new ideas that nobody ever talked about before, and I'm a practical application guy, and you give me an idea, let's see if it works. And our percentages of success are pretty high with this stuff.
Let's take a step back to the idea of negotiation. Most people don't really like negotiation. I'll share a quick one with you one time. I'll throw these numbers out because they're real. I'm not trying to impress anybody. It just happened, whatever, this is life. And I was jogging near a house that I owned in Vienna, Virginia. And there was a guy in the house right next door to me. I kind of thought about buying just for strategic reasons, for development reasons. And I was jogging by and the guy was raking leaves. It turned out he was a CIA agent in a past life. So I started negotiating with kind of an interesting character. But I immediately said to him as I'm jogging, I never really stopped. I said, "Hey, is your house for sale?" And he said, "Sure, how much?" And I said, "Well, how about 800?" And he said, and I never stopped jogging. And he said, I said about 800. And he said, "How about $1 million?" And I said, "How about if we split the difference?" And he said, "Deal." He said, "Deal." And we walked over and shook hands. And that was the sum total negotiation right there. I mean, that's a lucky one. But talk about negotiation, because most people have, first off, life is negotiation, right? But most people have a big fear and aversion to negotiation. If you can get, and I hope people can already see this in our conversation in the first 20 minutes, if you can start to get over the hurdle and look at it, as you mentioned, scientifically, Urey, Kahneman, boy, there's a real advantage in life if you can just put the fear aside, isn't there?
Yeah, absolutely. And this fear really drives us away from a process that could be tremendously productive, because most of the time we think we're going to face Donald Trump, and that it's going to be combative. Everybody imagines our counterpart being that guy, and that it's going to be painful. Or if you come to a deal really quickly, and I'll walk away going like, I could have done better. I could have got more. So we're really hard on ourselves. I mean, I call this, you go to your holodeck, if you will. And in Star Trek, the holodeck was a room on the Starship Enterprise where you could go and create whatever reality you wanted to. And our holodeck kind of gets away from us sometimes. But if you can get to the point where you actually enjoy the process, and the first thing really is don't take yourself hostage. And we take ourselves hostage by feeling like we have to make a deal. So if you can walk away from any interaction, if you don't like it, then that frees you up to enjoy the process and make a big difference. It makes a big difference in what you can come up with. And the only way to get to that point is to do it enough times in small stakes negotiations. So you kind of get good at it. You kind of enjoy it. You turn it into an opportunity like, look, if we don't make a deal, at least you and I had fun talking to each other.
Yeah.
And then it changes. Then you can take the fear out of it. We don't beat ourselves up as much, and you get more out of life.
A slight sidetrack for a moment. This just popped into my head because I had this note written down, and I want to kind of get back into, for a moment before we get back into the business realm, going back in your experience. I've got this great line in front of me that it says, have you ever tried to devise a mutually beneficial win-win solution with a guy who thinks he's the Messiah? Now, so I mean, I love that because most of life, you're really not dealing with, the Hale Bop tennis shoe guys or the maniacs that are flying planes into buildings that want to find virgins up in the sky. Most of the time, people are really not that crazy. However, how in your past life did your world unfold when you were dealing with, and I'm sure at some point in time, you probably dealt with someone, maybe not, that really did think they were the Messiah, figuratively. How does that situation go down? Even though it's probably more rare, how does that go down for handling that particular situation when they're just, frankly, batshit crazy?
Yeah, well, even batshit crazy has patterns, which was, I was on Comedy Central a couple years ago when the government was shut down. There was a sequester, and the government just completely shut down, and everybody in politics was saying, they're trying to take us hostage. And Comedy Central thought it was funny, and they put me on with Jason Jones, and we actually did. They said, all right, so let's walk through this once. We won't give you any scripted lines, and you just answer how you normally would. And they literally said to me, what do you do when you're dealing with somebody who's batshit crazy? And I said, even batshit crazy has its patterns, and people that we think are batshit crazy, they have delusions that they're God's gift to the planet, and they're really frustrated that the rest of the planet doesn't see it that way. And that's it's called an extreme politician. So if you're on the left, that's called somebody from the Tea Party. If you're on your right, you call that person a Bernie Sanders supporter. Whatever your perspective is. And when I said that to them, they go like, "Wow, we don't have to script anything for you. This is actually the way the world really works." And they didn't script a thing for me. We just did it all off what I would normally say. So unless somebody's actually hearing voices, everybody has a desire for grandeur. It's just how badly we're infected by it. As soon as I start looking at your patterns, and then I will go with your patterns, then you become very predictable to me. And as long as you're not actually hearing voices, and there aren't that many people out there that are, then your emotions, no matter how out of phase they might be with mine, I can still influence those emotions. And that's what I do with the same stuff from the hotline. You sound frantic, you sound determined. That stuff works.
I'm thinking about a really horrible incident that, of course, everyone knows and recalls. But if I think to 9/11, the effective part of their strategy, perhaps, was that they walled themselves off, really, from any potential communication from somebody like you.
Yeah, that was the first thing, and had I had the opportunity to become engaged in that at the time, I would have said to our commanders, since these guys won't talk to us, this is a very bad sign. Like if we could have got on the radio and raised those planes before we knew where they were going, they would not have responded. And that is the number one first indicator of danger. when they won't open themselves up to you at all. And so, yeah, they walled themselves off. And a lot of things that a lot of people don't know about that is the recruiters that put those guys into place, they had, I think, 18 protocols that they had to follow before they got on those planes and did what they were going to do. And 17 of those 18 were to keep them psychologically in line because they were so afraid those guys were going to chicken out at the last moment and not do it. And that to me, that speaks to how this is all a game of psychology and influencing people's behavior through their emotions. And even the bad guys on the other side that we think are utterly determined to die, their recruiters are not so sure that they are, and that's how hard they work on these guys to make sure that they follow through.
When you start to look at it that way, it just it opens up a Pandora's box of how there's applicability in our own life. And I guess if I look at that example where you say, well, you didn't have the opportunity to communicate, they didn't want to communicate. Well, let's look at that in a business sense.
Right.
I can think back to an early business venture that I had. And, there was no communication. He would not communicate. And so it didn't surprise me that when a crazy Looney Tunes lawsuit showed up at my attorney's doorstep, it really didn't surprise me because he didn't communicate.
Right. Yeah, there you go. Right. You had a gut instinct that there was something was wrong here. A lot of what I do is, all right, let's take your gut instinct and the things that are the little voice in your head that's telling you that something is wrong here. Now, is there a strategy that we can engage to maybe kickstart this in an unexpected way? And that's actually one of the things that I think, in my book and in our approach, because a number of people have contributed to my philosophy. So I hate, the I, me, my all the time. So many people have helped me learn this stuff. If you've got somebody who's silent on the other side, and you send them an email, one-line email that says, have you given up on resolving this amicably? 999 times out of 1,000, not quite 1,000% of the time, but since they can say no to that and not commit themselves to anything, they'll respond.
Have you given up on resolving this amicably? Just that simple question. So, okay, take a step back. You're a guy that's got a decent handle on emotions, psychology, etc. What is that triggering? You're sitting there at your desk, you're already worked up, and the person that's your adversary, essentially, is sending you that email. And what does it cause inside the human condition to feel?
All right, so when we say no, we protect ourselves. So having protected yourself, you immediately relax and you kind of center yourself. And so then that in and of itself, you're a little more open to listening because it calms you down. Saying no calms people down. It makes them say, like, all right, I've already protected myself. It's okay to proceed. Now, the other thing this does is it also triggers the thing that Danny Kahneman was talking about. In the fear of loss drives people. Saying that you've given up on something, to say yes to that, is to possibly open up yourself to loss, which we don't like. So again, saying no protects you from that loss, and you're afraid you're going to miss out on an opportunity, and so you're more likely to engage to avoid a loss than you are to accomplish a gain. And so it's kind of a double hit at the same time. Now, myself and clients and students have restarted negotiations that there have been extended periods of complete silence from the other side. The thing that you have to know is when you restart that conversation, you cannot go back to the same communication you were using before. You cannot go back to selling. You cannot go back to trying to convince them of your position. Actually, your next move, you absolutely have to get them to say, that's right, to however you follow this up. And what you're going to get them to say that's right to may sound like it's against your perspective. You may say, look, it probably seems like I've been completely unreceptive to anything you've had to say, and it seems like I've been taking advantage of you. Now, those are two very carefully worded statements. You never admitted that you are, but you respected their perspective, that it seems that way, which then encourages them to talk even more.
Do you have off the top of your head a that's right color example that people can kind of really grasp the idea what you're saying, that that's the objective, is to get them to that's right?
There was one of my MBA students is a pharmaceutical saleswoman, and she's got a doctor that's in her territory, if you will, that is not giving her the time of day on their most recent drug that the pharmaceutical company is probably very high profit drug, hot into the market. They're anxious to make it. And while he'll keep appointments with her, he's always multitasking. He's typing on a computer. He's just barely tolerating her. She decides she makes another appointment. She got one objective. She's going to get a that's right out of him. But it's got to be from his perspective and almost against her interests in what she's going to say. So she sits down with him and she says, your patients are more than just patients to you. They're people. You feel responsible for their lives and for their long-term health, and you are not just going to take the latest drug from some pharmaceutical company who's trying to maximize its profits, who doesn't care about your patients, doesn't even know who they are, and doesn't care that they know, and just sees them as possible dollar signs. You're not just going to accept the latest recommendation from a salesperson because your patients are human beings that you feel responsible for their lives. And notice how she puts that. That was almost like she should usher herself out the door with that. She said he turned and looked at her as if he'd never seen her before and said, that's right. He felt, I know from studying this after the fact, he felt connected to her. He felt genuinely and completely understood, and she ends up making the sale as a result.
It just puts in perspective. It's the emotional drivers. Even if we think we're Spock, the Vulcan, we're really not, are we? We're just not. We're a mess of all kinds of stuff.
Right. Hostage negotiators, the edge that we had was like, we never tried to pretend people were rational. So we learned a bunch of tools that were like, okay, they're emotional, they're wired a certain way. And even before I heard about prospect theory as a hostage negotiator, we were always searching for the loss. We knew the loss was the driver. And so give me a set of skills that gets me to that as quickly as possible, establishes rapport, and gets me nearly everything I want without giving up anything in return. People are human. People are human. And give me those skills and let me accept the fact that, we're driven by our passion and purpose in business. What we care about is what we value, and that's how we make decisions based on what we care about. And I can put these in a business context and make deals that other people can't make.
Let me go back in time again a little bit too, because I think this can come forward as well into a business example. I'm just terribly curious. All of the kidnappers that you dealt with, does one come to mind? Of course, look, if you go down the kidnapping direction, you're not really trying to do good, most likely. You're kind of have fallen off the wayside to kind of a bad direction. However, that doesn't say that particular individual is not extremely bright, have good technique, good strategy, very smart. Is there a kidnapper that comes to mind for you that you learned something from them, or am I just digging for something that doesn't exist? Is there a memory of one where you kind of walked away, even though they were just gone the wrong direction in life, you walked away and said, wow, that was an interesting experience. I really learned a tremendous amount from that.
I think I learned from everything. I mean, the one that really opened my eyes much more in how every phase of hostage and kidnapping negotiation really drops into business. We got a lone serial killer, lone kidnapper who's a cab driver in the Philippines. I talk about it in the book. And he was the only lone kidnapper that I'd ever heard of. And I know enough about kidnapping that it's kind of, if I haven't heard of it, it might have happened, but it probably didn't. So this was the first guy that I ever heard of, let alone worked. And he was exactly like the guy in a bank robbery that was very manipulative, in that he wouldn't use a singular personal pronoun to save his life. He was like they, them, the rest of the kidnappers, these guys, those guys. He was always laying it off to somebody that wasn't on the phone. He never would say I, me, or my in regards to anything. He would never say I want. Just like the guy in a bank 20 years earlier would never say, this is what I want. He kept talking about the other guys that were more dangerous. And this has come to be a known tell in business negotiations. If the guy across the table is always, he won't say what I want. He's talking about what his team wants and what they're going to do or not here. That's the guy. You've got the decision maker at the table, and he's doing his level best to hide his hand. And I can remember this kidnapping in the Philippines. He was so in love with the plural pronouns at the time. I never imagined he was a lone kidnapper, but I thought we were talking to the boss. He was working too hard to make himself seem powerless. The brother of the kidnap victim that I was coaching, he caught on really fast to our coaching. And we were focused on the, what we called then open-ended questions, which were how and what questions. And now we call them calibrated because they're calibrated for effect. And he got so good at it that, he has the perfect double combination, which was he put when and what together. And he said, when we run out of money paying you, what's going to happen to my brother? And the kidnapper on the other side, he felt so empowered by that question. He wasn't threatened in any way. And he hesitated for a while and he said, it'll be all right. And the moment I heard that, I said, we got this guy. He just promised never to hurt our hostage, no matter what happened. He just promised. And we did. And at the time, I had no idea the guy was a killer. So to get a killer to promise that, as a result, under his own power, I knew it was a genuine response. They ended up doing a rescue. This guy was so smart that he'd been communicating via email. He thought he disguised his email. It was actually the second rescue attempt. The first one, he had wired his cell phone to the antenna on a roof 3 blocks away from where he really was. And they thought they triangulated his cell phone. They went out and they went on a raid one night. They missed him by so far that he didn't even know there was a raid. And they ended up grabbing this guy. We find out everything about him. We find out about other kidnappings. One of them I knew of where he cut off the ear of a victim. Another one I didn't know about till we arrested him. He had taken a ransom and the victim had never surfaced, which means he killed him. And so we were with this extremely shrewd, extremely intelligent killer who was as cold as they come. And we used this stuff on him and figured him out and outmaneuvered him and caught him with it.
It gives hope to about just any situation, doesn't it?
I think it does. I've never claimed that my book will help you make every deal on the planet, but I've always felt like this approach to negotiation leaves you better off every single time. There are some deals that you don't want to make, depending upon the circumstances. But without fail, with this approach, every deal is improved every single time.
I want to dig through a few points that I just think are really interesting. I'd like to hear you elaborate them on this. Why questions, how questions, your rule of 3, and the difficulty of lying 3 times. It's just a fascinating, and look, that we could tear this apart all day long and talk about it, but I would love for you to give that kind of top-down overview of what I'm driving at there. I think the audience will find it really interesting and thinking, of course, they need to go dig more and dig into your work, but I think I'd love to hear some from you about it.
All right, the why questions, now that's a strategy. That is a black belt strategy. All right, so why makes people feel defensive? So if I want to know why you did something, and I may need to know why you did it, if I ask you why, it's going to make you defensive, it's going to hurt our relationship. And when I first started teaching in business schools, we used to say, never ask why. And a lot of people improved all of their business communications by just dropping the word why entirely, and instead would say, what made you do that, instead of why did you do that? Instead of why is that a good choice? What makes that a good choice? Change your whys to whats. And then I learned that I could actually take the dynamic, and if I were to say to you, why would you ever switch away from my competitor, and why would you ever come to me? I mean, why would you ever do business with me? And suddenly they defend doing business with you. and in a way where they now begin to articulate what you would have said, but it means more because it's coming out of their mouth. That saves me time because now I've got you defending me. So why is the one strategic use of it that'll help you, and be aware of when it hurts you? How questions are enormously powerful. How questions make people feel large and in charge. People love to be asked how, and you can take a how and construct it in a way where, I've really boxed you in. Like, if I don't get what I want, how are we supposed to make a deal? How am I supposed to give you what I want if I don't at least get a fair exchange out of it? I mean, you're going to feel in charge because I've asked you how, but I've really just put real constraints on how you can answer. And I can also use that to do something that we refer to as forced empathy, which when I say, if you want me to do something I can't do, and I say, how am I supposed to do that? It makes you take a hard look at me, which is the forced empathy. And coaching a client earlier today with in a negotiation where the other side has all the power on him, personal guarantees, significant amount of money. He's got to re-up on the documents at high rates of interest. They call him to sign again or go to court, and he's got nowhere to go. And he says, how am I supposed to do that? And instead of saying, because you have to, the other side says, so you're telling me you don't have any other options? Which now is a softening of a stance, and it's somebody saying they're open to options, which is a big change from because you have to. So, and that's what happens with the how question. They'll soften some. They'll give you some room someplace. And then, finally, lying 3 times, nobody will lie exactly the same way 3 times in a row. They're going to switch it every time. So someone will either stick to their lie and expand on it, which is the Pinocchio effect. If they try harder to convince you, if they throw more words into it, then they're actually giving you room. They're giving you more ammunition. They're giving you more opportunity to see the lie. Or in one instance, somebody asked me, I said I was going to do something that I didn't mean to do. I was loaned a personal compact disc that had a bunch of personal video on it, and there was no harm in me duplicating the video. So I was going to borrow and duplicate it. And they said to me, "You're not going to duplicate the video, are you?" And I go, "No, I'm not going to duplicate it." And then she said to me, "But no, you're really not going to duplicate it, are you?" And I said, "No, I'm not going to duplicate it." The second time I said it, internally I went, doggone it, now I said it twice. I can't do it. She got me to promise once. I could live with not keeping up to my promise, but promising twice, she didn't even have to take me 3 times. I'm the kind of person, if I say I'm going to do something twice, let alone 3 times, you know what? I'm going to do it. You'll get me to do something I don't want to do because I've got enough ego in my own words that if I tell you more than once I'm going to do it, it's going to happen. And that's an interesting way to turn somebody around when they may be hoping to sort of tell you a white lie once, but they won't tell the same white lie twice, and then it's no longer a lie.
Chris, never split the difference, negotiating as if your life depended on it. The title of your work. Why the main title? Never split the difference. Why the main title?
Because the first thing anybody learns in a negotiation, and, the guy that you bought that house with, you settled for $900, right? Mm. He probably wanted $900, but he knew, splitting the difference puts him at $850. So all he's got to do is raise his asking price, and then he can say, hey, let's split the difference, and it seems fair. It seems like both sides won. It's a high anchoring effect. A lot of negotiation instruction that just says, just raise your price and ask for more, and you're going to end up where you wanted to be all along.
In my situation, weren't we splitting the difference though? He said 800, I said $1 million, we settled for 900. Wouldn't that be a definition of splitting the difference, and that worked out good for both sides? Or am I?
Well, both sides tend to be very happy with that, and it's a shortcut. But I know as a seasoned negotiator, if I want more, I just got to raise my offer in one direction or another, and then I move the middle. That's all I'm doing. I mean, there's an old saying that the guy that wants to split the difference with you has a poor judge of distance.
My example is interesting and fun, but it's definitely not textbook.
I get what I want originally by just asking for more.
Right.
When I went through Harvard Law School's negotiation course, in order to ensure that they gave me a slot for free, I asked for 4 slots. I didn't want to put 4 people through there from the FBI. I'd have been happy if they'd have given. I just wanted to guarantee that they gave me what I really wanted, which was 1. So I said, look, they got back to me. They promised me. I said, I got 4 people I want to put through. And they go, oh, we can't do 4. We could do 1. And I went, okay.
It's such a fun conversation because I think we could literally sit down and just go through. Look, it's almost like as I'm listening now, it's like I want to go to class. I want to go. I want to start from the beginning. I mean, I'm kind of having to pick and choose a little bit from your work and stuff, but it makes me really want to sit down because it is. Life is negotiation. Every damn day, I'm negotiating 2 book contracts right now, and they make me want to just. And I watch their motivations, and their motivations on some things don't make any sense, except they just want to win. Really, I'm looking at major publishers, and some of these line items have no benefit to them at all, but they just want to win because what they want is they've been told that they need to make sure that they protect some right that they might use 5 years from now where they want to have the upper hand on me. And it completely has nothing to do with getting the book that we want to work on right now done.
Yes, right. And they get so emotionally determined on things that don't make sense, right?
But everyone listening can think of these examples in their own life. And I implore people to take a good read of Never Split the Difference, Negotiating as If Your Life Depended on It. Christopher Voss. Definitely check it out. Chris, hopefully we can talk again in the future. I think you could tell. I think this is just a really interesting stuff. And your direction and how you got there, the non-traditional way. Look, I'm a non-traditional guy. So anybody that comes at hacking the system and gets in through the rear entry and it doesn't come in the front door, but then ends up at the front of the line. Yes. It's all good, right?
Yeah. Thank you, Michael. This was a lot of fun to have this conversation. I really enjoyed it.
I appreciate it. Hopefully we'll talk again soon, sir.
I hope so too. Thank you.
And now for the bonus material that I mentioned in the intro. More great color from Chris Voss. This is a fascinating read. I think for me, immediately you start to just realize, wow, how wrong I am in almost every aspect of negotiation. Look, I've done pretty good in my life, but when you see how you guys have gone ahead and figured out the science and the psychology behind it all, it's quite amazing.
Thanks a lot. It's a little harsh to say, but I don't want anybody to think that they're wrong. I mean, I think a lot of people succeed really well because they know their business and they're really good at their business, which gives you reason to think you're probably a good negotiator. It's just that you can get better at negotiation. You're probably just better at having to be better at your business.
Let me break this apart to some heavy stuff right off the bat, and we'll come back in examples and backfill, etc. So 2 of the people that you talk about in your book prominently, and I want you to outline their contribution to the field and then how you have synthesized it. But 2 people that you talk about in your work have been on my show, Bill Urey and Daniel Kahneman. Why don't you blend in how you have taken from both individuals to put together, and it's not just you alone, but you've been a guy right there at the forefront, how this synthesis of Urey's work and Kahneman's work has led to better negotiation tactic.
The getting to yes stuff with Bill Urey and Roger Fisher, that's the intellectual structure behind negotiation. It makes a lot of sense, and I think it's helpful for people to understand it. I never met anybody that had really dug into negotiation that wasn't impressed by the work of getting the yes, and I also never met anybody who ever said, wow, I cut all these deals because I read Getting to Yes, which is kind of crazy, right? Because the intellectual structure is there. It's helpful to understand. But Danny Kahneman, that's just really how people are, really around how the people are driven by loss and how they perceive loss. And it's not intellectual at all. It's not rational. It's just not. And Kahneman's stuff is so powerful, and loss stings twice as much as an equivalent gain. And people are driven by that loss aversion. Yeah, that's it exactly. So, how do we blend this framework? And then once you blend those two ideas, then the hostage negotiators just give you a set of tools to navigate those ideas. And so that's where I think it really comes in from three areas, because hostage negotiators just understand that people are driven by fears and by loss. And maybe they won't say the word fear, but if you're concerned about something, if something is giving you a little bit of stress, anxiety, that's fear in disguise. And so much of what people do around us is driven by fear that you have to take it into account.
Let's take apart an example. I'm thinking off the top of my head, because I just read this recently and I'd read it years ago. I believe decades back, maybe not that long, Steve Wynn, one of his children was kidnapped. I don't know if it was an international situation. Walk the audience through, and then we'll go ahead and figure out how to explain this from a business perspective, why this is useful. But walk the audience through. Here, perhaps you get the call, and Steve Wynn's child has been kidnapped. Perhaps it's an international terrorist. I mean, you take that phone call, that initial phone call. There's still, even though you've got all this experience, and I want you to explain some of those early steps how you start to build that rapport, but there's still fear on your end. I mean, I just can't imagine putting myself in your shoes and getting that call, and I would immediately be thinking, man, one wrong move, and this kidnap victim might die. You might be the last person to say something to the terrorist or the kidnapper, and they might take action based on what you say. That's a tough position to be in, isn't it?
Yeah, well, once I understood the process, and once I thoroughly understood my adversary in kidnapping, I mean, I got to the point where I did it enough times that, in that line of work, in that business, now on my side, there wasn't fear. Now, the family's scared to death. But I learned how to navigate that stuff too. And the kidnapper is a businessman. The kidnapper, it's a transaction. And he's going to the ATM that he thinks is going to kick out the most money. And he's got a very definite process in mind. And he really doesn't care one way or another. He just wants some money. Once I thoroughly understood kidnapping, and I thoroughly understood that kidnappers were just commodities dealers, I understood what their moves were. And their moves are based about fear and control and intimidation. Then once those are givens, a kidnapper is a relatively easy person to cope with. And it's not one wrong move in any negotiation. It never is. A straw that broke the camel's back really is a series of bad moves. And then in any negotiation, the other side is going to telegraph to you how bad those moves are and how close you are to the end. If it would have been Steve Wynn's child, I know that they want the money more than anything else, and they lust for it, and they can be controlled by that lust. And their lust is also a combination of love and fear, which gets us back into this fear thing again. And they're horrified that they can't get what they lust for. And again, you harness fear in a negotiation, you have the upper hand.
When you get on that call, I mean, they just want to get their best price. And you're trying to just find that mutually beneficial deal.
Well, no, I'm trying to make them feel like they got their best price. That's what I'm after.
Explain that more.
Kidnappers are real good. We had an old saying, when is the kidnapper going to release a victim? When they feel like they got everything they could. And the classic word there is feel, when they feel like they got everything they could. So we put them through a series of paces. They think fear is their weapon, so we tell the family to be afraid. And as soon as we step into the other side's great strength and turn it against them, then it empowers us. Patience no longer is, I never told people to be patient. I said patience is a weapon. And that would immediately transform the exact same set of circumstances to them. They want to get the best price. They want to push you as hard as they can, and they're gonna gauge that on your emotional reaction, like how scared you get, how much you show that fear, and then that combined with some very psychological approaches in bargaining. When you make a raise, and the next raise that you make after that has to be smaller than the one before, and then the next raise after that has to be smaller than the one before that, and you got to use odd numbers. And way numbers hit everybody's brain in every transaction. And pretty soon we make the kidnappers think they've gotten everything they can. And then when they feel like they've gotten everything they can, and they feel like they did the best they could do, then they perform, because you can't sue them afterwards.
I like this perspective from, I guess I don't call it perspective, this lesson that I can immediately see from your work. You get the call, you're taking the call. He says, hey, I want $2 million for Bob. And your first question, the open-ended question, which I think is really clever when one is not trained like you're trained, how do you know that this person is alive? And that open-ended question, it's not only just that particular question, but the open-ended question and starting that series of open-ended questions. Talk about the benefit there and what you're trying to do.
How is your go-to question? How is an extremely seductive thing to answer? We wanted to take a very deferential approach. And I believe that there's great power in deference. When you're deferential, you can really, really push the other side. You can take passive aggression to a new high if you're deferential. The first time I realized how powerful it was when I heard it happen, when a kidnapper, a drug dealer who had his girlfriend was kidnapped, used it on another kidnapper. And I listened to the whole dynamic in a kidnapping change. And the guy that asked the question got the upper hand. The kidnapper on the other side never knew that was what had just happened. Because when you get asked a how question, you love it. Because people love to be asked how. It makes a person being asked that question feel large and in charge. And there's nothing like getting somebody to drop their guard than making them feel large and in charge. And that's how we would get the upper hand, because it would put the whole burden of the problem on the other side. And they wouldn't know it because they felt like they were in charge.
Not only the how question, but some of your initial process too. Talk about the mirroring, the giving people the vision of what they want to see and giving it right back to them. It's just really fascinating how you have to go about this, because I don't think your background is in psychology or psychiatry, but clearly you have learned on the fly and probably can sit down and talk with most psychologists and psychiatrists and be on the same plane, I'm guessing.
Yeah, I don't like to use the big words that they use, but yeah, I could sit down and have a conversation with them. And they would use the big words that they use to describe the stuff that I do. And I would smile. I could smile and nod at them and say, you're right. And they'd be really happy. They'd feel very good about themselves. They are all the same techniques. I mean, it's getting somebody to talk. It's getting them to let their guard down. It's getting them to feel not the least bit threatened at all, which, is exactly what someone who wants to be in charge feels. And in most bargaining situations, and a kidnapping is a bargaining situation, the person on the other side is trying real hard to feel in charge. So mirroring is another way to get them talking, to keep them going, to make them feel like they have complete control, even when they're terribly insecure and timid and they're concerned about talking. And mirroring is this just magic, just repeat the last 1 to 3 words that they said. And nobody, until they try it, nobody believes that it works. They think it's crazy. If I mirror someone, they're gonna know that you just used a hostage negotiation trick that Chris Voss taught you. How dare you? But they love it.
You've got some great examples in your work, positive examples, things that worked out. Let me ask you off the top of your head, though, because I'm sure there's at least 1 or 2 situations that you can recall that perhaps did not go right, and perhaps you were right involved with that situation. Can you recall one of those events and perhaps talk about the lesson that ultimately came out of it?
Well, yeah, and the Burnham case in the Philippines, we'd coached the family through negotiation with the kidnappers, and we thought that the kidnappers were going to let them go, and they didn't. And then about a month after the kidnappers took the family's money, there was a botched rescue attempt by the Philippine Scout Rangers, and Martin Burnham was killed by friendly fire, and Deborah Yap, the last Philippine hostage, was killed by friendly fire, and Gracia Burnham was wounded. And I thought we were going to get him out about a month earlier, and we didn't. And then when it got even worse, that not only did they not come out, that there were 2 out of 3 of our last hostages died. That was a really, professionally, it was a low point. Personally, it was a low point also, although sometimes I think it's a little self-centered of me to talk about how low it was for me when nobody in my family died. I didn't lose a loved one the way that the Burnham family, the way they did. that was a low point. And at the time, we did everything we knew how to do at the time, and it wasn't enough. It was inadequate. I had a lot of help on a case. I had a lot of help on every case I ever worked. And we went back everything that we did and talked about it after the fact. And we just had to get better. There was just, if what we knew wasn't enough, we had to get better. We had to raise the level of our game. If I was going to keep doing it and not let anything like that happen again.
How did you get better?
Well, that was really a combination of a couple of things. I went to, that was when I started getting involved with my friends at Harvard, who weren't my friends yet. Thank God when I went up there and showed them my business card, they were receptive to talking. And we started to collaborate with them and talk about ideas. And in reality, I thought that our techniques were actually more advanced than theirs were at the time. They talked a lot about active listening. A friend of mine up there, Bob Bourdon, at the beginning of one presentation that he gave, he actually said, active listening is a stealth weapon of effective negotiation. So we're on the same sheet of music, but we had evolved it to a much more refined degree. What really made the difference as we were trying to get better was I came to understand the power of the how question, the how, the what question. And what I really did was try to infuse, hard bargaining tactics with what we now refer to as tactical empathy. Actually, when I read Jim Camp's book, Start With No, which really refocused me on a tool that we already had of the open-ended questions. And then I heard the Pittsburgh drug dealer use it in a kidnapping. That's when I realized we had really looked at negotiations where there was hard bargaining as not being an appropriate place for the strategic and tactical use of empathy. We primarily only used empathy in barricaded situations, or when I had that bank robber that I negotiated with at that bank in Brooklyn. That wasn't really bargaining. That was just straight empathy, because I didn't want to bargain in any meaningful way. I just wanted to hit him hard with these emotional intelligence tactics and get him to give up and come out, which he did. But it never really occurred to me what would happen if you were just really kind of, very aggressively use empathy with aggressive bargaining techniques. And when we threw the two of those together, and we found we had something ridiculously powerful. And we gained such a huge advantage in our hard bargaining techniques when we pushed, I know it sounds crazy, but assertive empathy. I mean, weapons grade empathy, tactical empathy.
Give me an example. Paint a picture for me really quick.
I used empathy when I bought my truck, my Salsa Red Pearl Toyota 4Runner that I'm in love with. Which is saying what's on the other guy's mind. And so I knew that the car salesman was going to tell me it was a beautiful truck, that it was worth $36,000, that I was in love with the truck, because I was clearly in love with the truck. And so I said it first. I said, this is a beautiful truck. And especially if you can say things that seem to be against your interest, that seem to favor the other side. You set them up. How am I supposed to do that is the knockout punch question when you set it up with tactical empathy. So I said, the truck's beautiful. It's fantastic. I feel bad offering you anything less than $36,000 for this truck, because it's probably worth more than $36,000. The Blue Book is high. It's in fantastic shape, and I love it. But how am I supposed to do that? How am I supposed to pay that? And when you articulate everything that they say, you take away everything they have to say. And especially then if you follow it up with, this incredible, brutal, deferential question, 95 times out of 100, they crumble. So why do you need, I don't need to deal with those 95 situations that I could have solved with this approach. I only need to make a substantive counteroffer in a small percentage of the times that a substantive counteroffer is actually required.
And that is right about the time that Chris lost his voice on our first conversation. I hope to have Chris on many more times in the years to come. His book, Never Split the Difference, Negotiating as If Your Life Depended on It, is on Amazon. Grab a copy. His website, The Black Swan Group, blackswanltd.com. Check it out. a really fun conversation, and I feel lucky every day to do this podcast and keep learning from all these super, super smart people. The last couple years, my guests, and I'm sure many of these people are peers, friends, associates, my guests have included Daniel Kahneman, Vernon Smith, Gerd Gigenrinzer, Steven Pinker, Laurie Santos, Collard Cameron, Anders Ericsson, Dan Ariely, Phil Tetlock, Barry Schwartz. The list goes on. I would have had you on much earlier, but you have been cloistered. You have been immersed in a project now coming up for air. Yes?
You're right. It was the book that has just been released last week.
Yeah. One of the things I would love to jump in at the very beginning here. So we've had this rise of behavioral economics, and then we look at your world from a psychology perspective. Can you talk a little bit about, and I think, Daniel Kahneman helped to break this wall a little bit, and this could be a very long discussion, much more than a half hour, but can you talk a little bit about behavioral economics and the social psychology, your realm, and perhaps the overlap? And is there a confusion? Is there a competitiveness? How do you see that today?
Well, I think that there's a deep connection between social psychological approaches and behavioral economic approaches, both of which suggest that human behavior is best predicted and described in terms of a set of factors that don't require that we think about economic self-interest as the major determinant of choices. There are all kinds of other factors, values, emotions, attitudes, and so on, that carry the day as well. And it's important to say as well, because we're certainly not suggesting that economic and fiscal factors are unimportant. It's just that they're not the sole or even in many instances the most determining factor in the situation.
You're very well known for your book Influence. It's become this more than a cult classic. It used to be a cult classic. Now it's just a standard. And so you mentioned, and I mentioned your newest work, Persuasion. It helps, I think, for sure, for people to see Influence ahead of time. And there's a great video on YouTube that goes through a very brief overview. You have your 6 classic principles of influence: reciprocity, consistency, social proof, authority, liking, scarcity. But in your newest work, you see something coming before that. And I mentioned that word priming. And I think anytime any of us want to have an audience or an individual be receptive to a particular piece of persuasion that we might have, there's an earlier step, isn't there?
You're exactly right. One of the things I learned when I was researching this book is that very often the majority of communicators think that the way to optimize the success of a message that they deliver is to spend time getting the message content right, the structure of it, the clarity of it, the attractive features of it. All of that is true, but that's not how we optimize influence. We optimize that process in the moment before we deliver that message by putting recipients in a state of mind that makes them open and receptive to the message we are about to send.
It seems so simple. It seems like common sense. I can tell the audience out there, while that might seem like common sense, the research, the findings behind this, the depth of persuasion, it takes a little bit of time to get through. I will say this, though, also, I can see that you have a lot of fun with this.
Oh, I did, because it was an adventure. It broke the set I had growing up with a model of persuasion that suggested that if I wanted to move people in my direction, I had to do something with my message to change their attitudes, their beliefs, their experiences with what I had to offer. this new research changed everything by suggesting I didn't need to alter anything inside my recipient except what they were paying attention to in the moment before I delivered my message.
Before we get into some examples, in our limited time today, we're just going to go through some examples, and I implore people, they're going to have to go do some reading to really get the full thrust and depth. But how did you start down this path? Was there an aha moment? I mean, here you're very well known for this classic book influence. What was the moment, the trigger, or was it a series of events that got you going down this path?
It was the latter, Michael. It was a series of recognitions as I read the newest research in behavioral science and persuasion science that a lot of the work on priming or anchoring or framing or creating mindsets didn't involve the 6 principles of influence. These things set up the 6 principles of influence. They teed them up in a way that gave them greater leverage. It forced me to go back to the research I had done in writing influence, which was to infiltrate as many influence professions as I could get access to by taking their training. I posed as a trainee, somebody who was interested in a job. And I learned from the inside what they were doing to move people successfully in the directions they hoped for. And I went back to my notes and I looked at what the top scorers in each of these professions were doing. Right? The aces of the professions, what were they doing? And they were acting like gardeners. That is, they recognized that it didn't matter how good the seed was that you wanted to plant. If you didn't prepare the earth first, if you didn't cultivate the ground, that seed wasn't going to take root and flourish. So they spent more of their time than their average contemporaries did creating a state of mind before they delivered their request that was consistent with the strength of their request.
We're talking about trust in many ways, building trust ahead of time. Why don't we give a little color? And I love, there's many examples in the book, but there's an example of a gentleman selling home alarm systems. A simple story, but the data and the results behind it, quite amazing. I think you recall this one where he leaves the house, then comes back in. Could you tell that story?
Yeah. So when I was infiltrating these training programs, I did get some training from a company that sold very expensive heat-activated fire alarm systems in the home. And they would send their salespeople into the home to convince people, usually a couple, that the expense was worth the safety involved in this heat-activated system. I would follow along with some of them during my training to see what they did. Well, there was one salesperson, his name was Jim, who was always the top salesperson. So I was especially concerned to see what he did. He did something remarkable to create trust in his customers, his prospects, before he ever presented the system. He would first get people engaged in taking a 10-minute questionnaire, a little test on their knowledge of fire safety in the home. Then while they were in the middle of the test, he would slap his forehead. He would say, "Oh, I forgot something out in the car. I need to go get it. It's some important information. Do you mind if I let myself out and back into your home?" And the answer was always sure. Sometimes it involved giving him a key to the front door. I saw him do this 3 straight times. And I asked him about it. And he said, "Look, Bob, who do you allow in and out of your house freely? Who would you give a key to your front door to? Only somebody you trust, right? I wanted to be associated with trust in the minds of that couple before I began showing them the information. because if they trusted me, now they believed what I had to say. It was brilliant, and it was persuasive. He established a mindset of trust before he asked people to consider the pros and cons of his offer.
Did he talk about how he figured that out? Was it just years of experience? Did he stumble into it? Did you get that data from him?
Yes, he said one time by accident, he actually did forget this material out in the car. And when he came back, a skeptical couple then dropped all the skepticism and became very open and yielding to what he was saying next.
I can imagine, though, throughout your career, you've had those moments where you did not expect something, and then boom, you turn around and it's right there. And you could do all the research in advance, but it's that split second, that happen chance, that serendipity, and boom, a light bulb goes off.
You know, something just happened to me like that, where I was the victim, and I saw the light bulb of persuasion go on in my head. I just had a guy who I do business with commit a major faux pas. He screwed up in a way that cost us, my business, a considerable amount of money. And he called to tell me about it. And before he told me about it, he said, "Now, Bob, I hate what I'm going to tell you. And I especially hate it when it happens to good guys like you, to nice guys like you." And then he told me about how he messed up. And Michael, he gave me the role of a nice guy. And I responded to him like a nice guy. I didn't scold him. I didn't demand that he make it right. I waved my hand and said, it happens. Happens to all of us.
That makes your point that you were saying in the very beginning, that thinking only in terms of rational self-interest, there's a wider connection amongst people that's happening.
Exactly right. He gave me a reputation to live up to. And I did.
It is one of these things. It's when you get into the subject, and again, that's why I say you must have so much fun with it, because as one reading the work, and I'm going to have to go back and read again, because it is one of these things, and I know you know this by design. Literally, you've tried to let the audience see that every sentence has meaning. That's a challenge, because I've written 4 books, so that's a challenge to do.
Exactly right.
That's not easy. Let me bring people in as you talk about that example with the client. I thought another fascinating example too was, I think it was a part of an example in the book, and it was somebody that was selling something, I believe, and they said something to the effect of, I'm not going to be able to charge you, and I'm making up the number here, I'm not going to be able to charge you $1 million, but, and then you drop it down. But that point of raising it up high, putting that in the mind, and then bringing it down, the research backs the idea that if you put that high number up, then bring it down, it's completely different than not having the high number, isn't it?
That's the phenomenon of anchoring. We can anchor a person's perception of what is a legitimate number by what we say first. Let's say I want to sell you a bottle of mineral water, right? I can get you to pay substantially more for it if I first ask you the distance to the sun. Because compared to the distance to the sun, that bottle of mineral water's price seems trivial. Now, that's what this friend of mine did. He's a consultant in Toronto. He was always getting pushback on the price he would state for a contract, let's say a $75,000 contract. He was always getting people saying, "Can you give us a break? Can you cut it by 10%, 15%? And he said one day by accident, he said something that eliminated that pushback, and that's been the case ever since. He shows people this contract with the charge of $75,000, but before they see it, he says, "As you'll be able to see, I'm not going to be able to charge you $1 million for this." Now, it never he says that's not enough to win the business every time, too many factors associated with that. But he says it always eliminates pushback on price, because compared to $1 million, $75,000 seems reasonable.
You've got a great line that you quote from Sun Tzu, and people have heard this before, but every battle is won before it's fought. Let me ask, in terms of the type of individual, what does the research show? So I've just kind of drew myself a little sketch of a bell curve here, and I'm imagining to myself, okay, Robert has put all this great research, the technique behind persuasion. Is persuasion, obviously I'm thinking in bell curve terms, it's gonna hit the masses for sure. I know that. Are there types of people, are there types of thinkers where persuasion is not as effective? Or have you found universally that across the populations, persuasion is just very effective?
It seems to be a universal human operating technique, operating procedure. And let me give you the best evidence I know for this, that it's built into us from birth. Right? There was a study done in Belgium. Researchers brought subjects into an experimental situation, and they showed them photographs with figures standing in the background. 1/3 of the subjects saw figures standing alone by themselves. Others saw pictures of 2 figures standing apart, separate from one another. A third sample of subjects saw photographs of figures standing together, shoulder to shoulder, unified. Now, the researcher in all of the cases then got up from the table and accidentally, I'm putting that in air quotes, dropped a series of items onto the floor, a bunch of items onto the floor. And the question is, who gets down on their knees spontaneously without being asked and helps the researcher pick up these items? It was by far 3 times as likely to be one of the people who saw photographs of figures standing together. Unity, togetherness is associated with cooperativeness and helpfulness, right? Now, that's the classic persuasive idea. What you do first, right, puts people in a state of mind that inclines them in a particular direction. And if that direction is what your goal is, you will get large-scale increases in the behavior you're looking for. Now, here's the thing that made me rock back in my chair when I read it about that study. The subjects were 18 months old. They were babies, Michael. They could hardly talk. They couldn't plan or reflect or reason. But this procedure is so primitive, so fundamental in us, that it got 18-month-old babies to be 3 times as likely to be helpful because they saw a picture of people standing together in a cooperative, unity-based pose.
You know, what's going to be really amazing, and I mentioned some names at the beginning, is the research that will get down to the cellular level to find out in the years to come, you know, how that unfolds, how the 18-month-old babies can be in that place of mind with no experience, no insights yet, but they're walking into the world with some genetic material that says, I'm predisposed to think like this.
You know, you mentioned Daniel Kahneman a little earlier as one of your previous guests, and somebody I respect very much. And he was recently asked if there's one thing that people could understand that would make them recognize how behavior unfolds in themselves and around them, what would it be? And what he said was, there's nothing that's as important as you think it is while you are thinking about it. Everything seems more important than you think it is while you are thinking about it. So the idea is that if we are thinking about a particular concept or an idea or even an image, right, it becomes more important in our eyes in the moment that follows. That's what happened to those children, those 18 months old. Simply seeing the idea of togetherness and unity became more important for them in terms of their actions than before.
Your world is one nonstop moment.
Well, I have to say, these things threw me back in my chair sometimes when I was reading about them. Here's another one that I just love. Suppose you're looking for support on a project, maybe with your boss. You've got a great idea, a plan. What we typically do is to ask for our boss's opinion about it in order to get some buy-in from the boss. That's a mistake. We should change one word persuasively. Instead of asking for your boss's opinion about your plan before you show it, ask for your boss's advice on your plan before you show it. Because when we ask for someone's opinion, what they do is take a half step back from us. It's a separating step. And they go inside themselves for the answer of what their opinion is. If we ask for their advice, they take a half step toward us psychologically. We get a mindset of partnership. And the research shows they're now going to be more supportive of our plan even before they see it, because they feel more a part of it.
You know, you mentioned one word, and I've got a note here. It's actually the next thing I was going to ask you about is the right word and the choice of a word. And maybe you're a great example right now with a new title out, Persuasion. I'm imagining that there was a certain amount of behind the scenes, there was a certain amount of sausage making that took place that allowed you to get to the point where you knew that persuasion was going to be the best word for the next many decades of your life, frankly, because you're gonna own this word now, and I'm sure a lot went behind it.
You know, Michael, that's very insightful what you just said, because for the first period of time when I was writing this book, the working title was Moments of Power. And the idea was to find those moments in the course of human exchange with one another, where a request or a recommendation or a proposal will be most powerful. And the more I read, the more I researched, it became clear it was the moment just before the persuasive appeal. So that's where this idea of persuasion came from. And you're exactly right that the hope is to coin a term. So people will be saying to one another, well, what's our persuasive moment here? What do we put persuasively in the instant before we make our request to give it special traction, to give it special leverage?
In our few minutes we have left, Bob, I have one last question, thought, let you elaborate some. But in your newest work, Persuasion, you talk about a new principle of influence. Unity, you call it. And I think a great example for my audience especially could be Warren Buffett. You have a great story about Warren Buffett and how he talks about his next, what will happen after him, who will take over, and how that will take place. And he really does a nice job of that, doesn't he?
He does a beautiful job in a way that I'd never seen him do before. I'm a Berkshire Hathaway shareholder, and for the last 15 years, I've been getting his shareholder reports, the annual letters that he writes to stockholders. Last year, he had a special challenge because it was the 50th year of Berkshire Hathaway since he and Charlie Munger took over and brought it to amazing levels of profit. Right? The challenge was, how does he keep people investing at these enormously expensive levels? A single share of Berkshire Hathaway stock this morning on the New York Stock Exchange was going for $221,000 a share. We've never seen anything like it in our markets. Now, his challenge is, how do you get people to keep investing in this when he and Charlie are getting up in age and might not be there next year? So he laid out a very reasoned statement of why we should continue to invest in Berkshire Hathaway because of the various basket of strengths that they have going for them. But before he did that, he said something persuasively that caused me to wipe away any idea of selling Berkshire Hathaway stock. He said, I'm going to tell you about the strengths of Berkshire for the next 50 years. And I am going to tell you this in a way that I would tell a family member if they asked me, Michael, I've never thought of selling Berkshire Hathaway again. He not only did he make that point the argument compellingly, I was ready to believe it more deeply than before because he was talking to me like a family member, someone who's inside the boundaries of his sense of we, of unity. Wow, I was just compelled.
It's not just they are like me, but they are of me.
That's the key literary difference, the key linguistic difference. It's not that we like Michael because he is similar to us. It's that we like Michael because he is of us. He's of us. And inside the boundaries of we, everything is easier inside for the influence process. People cooperate more. They believe you more. They trust you more. They change more in your direction.
Robert, I don't think I have to do much selling here. I think your enthusiasm and passion for the subject will win people over. I'm sure my audience will want to check out more. The book is available now, Persuasion, a revolutionary way to influence and persuade. Thank you for taking some time today. Is there a best website?
Yes, there is. It's called influenceatwork.com. Influence at Work is all one word, .com.
Again, the new book is Persuasion. Robert, I thank you for taking some time today. Great stuff.
Well, thank you for such a perceptive set of questions, Michael.
I appreciate it. Thank you. Unfortunately, today, I only had Robert for a short period of time. But due to the magic of the internet, I will now provide a speech of his that I thought was just really insightful. I hope you enjoy this presentation from Robert Cialdini.
I want to talk about behavior change, and I want to talk about the role of social norms in creating that change. But I'm going to talk about a particular kind of behavior, environmental behavior. How do we persuade people? How do we motivate people to move in our direction? That's been my research area for decades. But that applies to all kinds of behavior. I want to focus today on how we might persuade people to take environmentally friendly, sustainable action by changing the way we send the message to them. Just changing the words that we use to engage them in that behavior change. So I'll begin with a pair of contentions. The first is that program designers or decision makers can rely too much on economic factors, such as financial benefits, or on legal factors, such as regulations or laws, when seeking to motivate their citizens toward environmental goals. Now, those are effective strategies, there's no question about that, but they incur costs. The financial factors, bonuses, rebates, discounts, incentives of one sort or another, require economic resources that have to be applied to producing the change. And in our world, economic resources are not unlimited. So very often, they do not get applied to that particular crucial issue. I believe the issue of sustainability is as important as there is right now on this planet. But other goals can drive those resources away. So what happens if we don't have those economic resources to provide? Then we often rely on legal factors, regulations, rules, constraints. That provides another kind of cost to the decision maker or the program designer. It's a social cost. It's not an economic capital that we are expending. We're expending social capital because people don't like being constrained. They don't like being regulated. And they resist and they resent those individuals who try to do it. So is there a third way that we could think of that would also be effective but would not incur these costs? I'm going to suggest that indeed, yes, there is. It is the social norms of the situation. Making people aware of, making them conscious of what is the norm in that situation to do. Now, there's the fundamental kind of norm, which is information about what is normal there. What are the people around us, like us, doing there? What have they been doing there? That has an automatic tendency to drive people in that direction. Now, there are some amplifiers of that effect. We are most likely to move in the direction of multiple others and comparable others. Let me give you another way of saying that, and that is, it's what many others do and what similar others do that spurs us to move in that direction. Let me give you an example of how this works in a situation that doesn't involve environmental behavior, but I want to show the reach of this principle of social norms, and indeed even the cross-cultural reach, because it's a study that comes from restaurants in Beijing. Do you know that if the manager of a restaurant, in this case it was a series of restaurants in Beijing, marks the menu with notifications of which are the most popular items on that menu, a number of fascinating things happen. First of all, it produces an increase of 13 to 20% in the sales of those items immediately, without a single cost. The manager doesn't have to put more high-quality ingredients into those, doesn't have to hire a new chef, doesn't have to increase the pleasantness of the decor. No, just point to something that's true. These are the most popular items on this menu. And this applies, by the way, even to those items that people might not always order, starters, for example, or desserts. Suddenly, I know that when I go into a restaurant, I'm thinking, should I have dessert? Maybe I shouldn't. I had a big breakfast. I expect to have a large dinner. If I see on the menu, this is our most popular dessert suddenly. I have a reason to eat dessert that I didn't have before, suddenly. And it's a real reason. It's a reason that benefits all of us. I get a great dessert because it's the most popular one, and the owner, the restaurateur, gets an order for everyone benefits, except perhaps my waistline, which suffers. Secondly, notice that that strategy is not only effective, it is completely inexpensive, completely unpressured, completely honest, and here's the interesting thing, almost never employed. I've been counting. Fewer than 90% of 10% of the restaurants where I patronize say that on the menu. Now, I want to make a comment at this point. People might ask you about, didn't you say there were interesting speakers? There was one guy who talked about persuasion and influence. Oh, what did he say? Well, he told us that people want to do what they see others doing. You know what your colleague will say to you? With this, he makes a living. Really? I knew that. Everybody knows that. You wasted your time. Tell them about the Beijing restaurant study and say, if everyone knows that, why is it that in 90% of the restaurants that we frequent, there is no such message on the menu, if everyone knows this? See, we know these principles, and there are other universal principles of human behavior at a superficial level, but we don't know how to activate them optimally. We don't know how to amplify them optimally. Let me give you an example from environmental setting. It's the hotel towel research study that I and my team members did. If you travel at all, you know that in 70% of the restaurants that you frequent, somewhere in the room, there is a sign that the manager has put there asking you to reuse your towels and linen. Here's an example of one. Very often there is some nearly extinct woodland creature on the sign, and they ask us to save the environment by reusing their towels. We decided to see if there was a special kind of message we could put on that sign that would be more successful than the typical message. Here's an example of our sign that we put on in hotel rooms, 3 separate hotel rooms in the Phoenix, Arizona area in the United States where I live. Right? It said, help save the environment. That's the standard one. All those hotel managers want us to save the environment. They want us to save resources. They want us to save the earth. But we know they want to save something else too. No. They want to save costs. So what can they do? Well, they can say, save the environment, and hope that will spur us. But there are some especially clever ones now who have decided to use a principle of social behavior that says people prefer to do things in partnership with others, in collaboration, in cooperation with others. So some hotel chains are now saying on the sign, right, partner with us toward this common cause and hang up your towels. Right? So we put different signs like that randomly in these hotel rooms, and then we checked to see how many people actually hung up their towels. We were in league with the maids, right, who made a check mark. And let me show you what happened. On any one night, if the message said, do this for the environment, an average of about 38% of the people helped on that one night. Right? Usually more than 50% help at some time during their stay, but on one night, about 38%. If it said partner with us, any ideas about what the percentage would be under those circumstances? Any ideas? 50%? Nothing. Why? Because you don't get to just claim a partnership. you have to earn a partnership in order to get people to play with that system. This was what the hotel managers were saying to us. You pay us 295 euros tonight, and tomorrow you don't get to use a fluffy towel. That was their deal? It was no deal. But we had a third message, an honest message. It was one that employed the social norms. It said, the majority of guests at our hotel do reuse their towels at least once at some time during their stay. And under those circumstances, we get the most we have ever gotten. Now, here's an interesting question. Is there an even more impactful message that we can send, knowing what we know about the theory of social norms? There is. Remember what we said, is that we don't follow the lead of many others only. We particularly follow the lead of similar others. So we had a fourth sign. This one didn't say the majority of guests who stayed in our hotel in the past have reused their towels at least once. It said the majority of guests who've stayed in this room have reused it. Room 215, just like you. And under those circumstances, we get the most we have ever got. Let me say there are two notable things about this set of results. The first is those most successful strategies were both honest and inexpensive to employ. Secondly, we've never seen either of them in any city, in any hotel, in any guest room in the world. These aren't things that emerge as best practices within the organization. You have to know the behavioral science to hone your message properly. Why don't they know the behavioral science? Because on their board of directors, on their board of advisors, there will be someone from finance, there will be someone from logistics, there will be someone from transportation, there will be a legal person, and there will never be a behavioral scientist. There will never be a PhD level decision scientist on their board. And it's a mistake. It's a costly mistake. Okay, let's ask another question. All right. Well, is there any evidence that this normative information about similar others can influence what people do in their homes with energy conservation? Yes, there is. Yes, there is. Let me tell you about a study that I did with my colleagues, especially Dr. Wesley Schultz. We went to San Diego, California, and in random homes in particular neighborhoods, once a week for a month, we put a door hanger on the doors of homes in this neighborhood that had different messages. And we wanted to see what messages would be most effective in getting them to reduce their energy consumption that month. We also had a control group. One control group was some houses didn't get any message. We wanted to see so we wanted to compare the messages to that. We had a second control group where we had a sign that simply urged people to conserve energy. Here's the first finding. At the end of the month, when we looked at their energy usage, those two groups were identical. So simply urging people, simply exhorting people to save energy was the same as nothing. It was the same as nothing. They needed a reason. Well, let's talk about some reasons that we put on that sign. One reason is one you've heard: do this to save the environment. Another was, do this to be a socially responsible citizen, to benefit the society. A third was, do this for your own economic self-interest, so that you will save money at the end of the month on your utility bill. And the fourth was, the majority of your neighbors are undertaking energy-conserving actions on a daily basis, something we had found in a survey. Let me show you the daily kilowatt-hour usage of those signs plus the control group. All right? So here is the sign. right? This is the combined control group. Environmental protection, benefit to society, saving money, produce small deflections. The only one that made a significant difference is what your neighbors are doing. And it was true. We just had to point to it. Okay, let's finish up here by asking this question. How can we use this set of insights to advance national energy goals, right? One possibility is to involve the private sector in the process. There is a company in the United States, I happen to be the scientific advisor for this company, called O-Power. They've taken our results, and now they send consumers of utilities, energy companies, a message every month, not telling them how much energy they used last month, which you probably get in your message. They tell them how much energy you use compared to your neighbor. That's all, just compared to your neighbor. It looks like this. And let me show you the results in terms of energy savings, right? The longer these numbers are, the different utilities, the longer this is in place, the more energy is saved. It's now 3 years into the full commercial rollout of this company, and it has saved 1.7 billion kilowatt hours for telling people something honest. All right? Let's finish. The way I started with my contentions. Decision makers can focus too much on economic and legal reasons to motivate people. There are other reasons that don't just apply to energy, apply to general behavior. Besides this one, there are others, but social norms is one we should not forget.
If you want a good book to read for the holidays, if you want to keep everybody on your wish list up to date, I highly recommend Persuasion. Check it out. Again, Persuasion, a revolutionary way to influence and persuade. It's everywhere. Grab a copy. I see a time when those awake will understand how to make money in up, down, and surprise markets. Whether new trader or experienced, college student or financial advisor, protecting against a crash or just trying to make a lot of money, trend following offers everyone an answer in uncertain times. To get started immediately, send me an email, michael@covel.com. I will send you the right trend following steps to take along with my free video. But if you want to buy and hold, trust the government and trust Wall Street, this is absolutely not for you.